You think the North Atlantic is just cold, but the truth hits harder when you imagine a Viking longship. 40 men, no walls, no roof, no fire, cutting through a winter sea where every breath freezes before it even leaves your lips, and the wind slices across the deck like a blade sharpened by the gods. Temperatures drop low enough to kill a modern person in hours, yet these sailors endured week after week, wrapped only in wool, drenched in salt water, surrounded by waves tall enough to swallow a hull. What makes this moment unbelievable isn't just the cold, it's the choice behind it. Vikings sailed without a single ember on board, no brazier, no stove, no spark, because one wrong flame didn't mean losing warmth. It meant losing the entire ship. This wasn't reckless courage or primitive limitation. It was calculated survival, a strategic decision that shaped every voyage, every raid, every discovery. They lived between the frost on their beards and the spray freezing on the shields at their feet, depending not on heat, but on engineering, discipline, and the silent trust between men who knew one mistake could end them all. And before you scroll past this thinking, it's just another story from the past, try asking yourself, on the coldest night of your life, could you survive even a single hour on a ship that carried no fire at all? The first shock isn't how well the Vikings endured the cold. It's the way every archaeological site, from Norway to Denmark to Iceland, seems to whisper the same unbelievable truth in perfect unison. Not a single trace of fire has ever been found on a Viking ship. No charcoal flecks, no burn marks, no portable hearths, not even a stubborn grain of ash caught between the planks. This absence created a contradiction so sharp, it split the archaeological world for nearly 50 years. How could a civilization that crossed frozen oceans leave behind zero evidence of ever keeping warm? The biggest excavations, Skuldelev in Roskilde, Oseberg, Gokstad, even Gjellestad scanned with modern ground-penetrating radar, all repeat the same baffling scene. Researchers kneel, sift through layers of soil, lift every plank, every tool, every water barrel. And still the dig sites stay hauntingly empty when it comes to anything that ever held a flame. And it's that emptiness, the silence of a 1,000-year-old ship, that hits the hardest. It wasn't that they couldn't bring fire to sea. It was that they deliberately chose not to. So if you're starting to question, can this really be true? You're not alone. The archaeologists themselves felt the same doubt the first time they stared into that absolute impossible silence left behind by the Vikings. You might think the Vikings avoided fire on their ships simply because it was hard to light, but the real reason is so dangerous, it made an entire generation of researchers shiver. Those clinker-built hulls we imagine as rustic and simple were, in reality, the perfect explosive device. Overlapping planks packed with sheep's wool, hull seams smeared with sticky pine tar, rigging soaked in animal fat, and the massive sail, the very thing that carried them across oceans, was basically a giant dry torch waiting for a spark. And the darkest twist? A single ember the size of a needle tip could burn an entire longship to nothing in under 4 minutes, according to fire simulation studies run by North Sea maritime archaeologists. There were no sealed compartments, no bulkheads, no safe zone to slow the flames. Once fire took hold, the Arctic wind would turn the whole vessel into a floating inferno right in the middle of a frozen sea, where there was no shore to run to, no calm water to fight back with, and absolutely no second chances. But the part almost no one realizes, and this is where the shock truly lands, is that the Vikings knew this risk.
Yes.
They understood exactly how fast their planks would burn, how the tar would behave, how the northern wind would drag the flames across the deck. And they still chose to sail in a vessel they themselves called skipsleaf, a ship that could kill its own crew if mishandled. Once you grasp this, their voyages stop looking like reckless bravery and start looking like a razor-sharp survival strategy. And if you thought you knew even a little about Viking ships, drop a comment below. Did this twist hit you as hard as it forced archaeologists to rethink decades of old theories? What confuses most modern people isn't that the Vikings lacked technology. It's that they deliberately left their own technology off the ship. Inside their winter longhouses, three-legged hearths glowed red. Iron pots hung from fire-lit chains, bread baked over hot embers, and soup simmered for hours in soapstone vessels that held heat like a battery. They absolutely had the ability to bring all of that aboard. Lightweight tripods, sturdy iron cookware, long-burning charcoal, even wind-resistant stone stoves. But they didn't. Not a single hanging pot, not a single coal, not one reasonable cooking tool ever appears on deck. And this is the point so illogical, it almost feels suffocating. A civilization whose cooking techniques were so advanced that later European chefs borrowed from them chose not to use any of it in the place they needed it most. The real reason lies in something they understood better than anyone else.
It's a testament to their incredible
One
skill.
drifting ember landing on pine-tarred planks in the middle of a North Sea windstorm isn't a minor risk. It's a collective death sentence. So the very hearths that kept them alive on land became forbidden objects the moment they stepped onto a ship.
It's in the way that
in the longhouse, fire was a friend. At sea, fire was a traitor. And that reversal makes you realize the Vikings didn't survive through luck or sheer toughness. They survived through a level of survival discipline almost absolute. If you've ever wondered, why didn't they just cook on the ship to stay warm? Trust me, you're not alone. That question fooled archaeologists for decades. What films always leave out is the living heat technology the Vikings wore on their own bodies, a portable microclimate engineered from wool, animal fur, and natural fats that allowed them to survive in a world where your breath freezes before it even hits the air. Imagine a single wool fiber magnified under the gray northern light, each strand twisted in 3 layers, the outer layer pushing water away, the middle layer trapping warm air, the innermost layer clinging to the skin like a thin blanket. When waves crashed over the deck, cold seawater soaked the surface of their clothing and froze into tiny crystals along the fiber tips. Yet the body heat inside stayed sealed tight, creating a strangely warm feeling even while they were completely drenched. Look even closer, and you'd see the fur layer trembling with each gust of wind, tiny droplets of frost turning into silver grains along the edges, while beneath it all sat a thin pocket of hot air, carefully created by layering materials with different levels of breathability and heat capture. That combination turned their clothing into a portable furnace, strong enough to keep a sailor alive when the north wind cut across the sea and temperatures sank far below freezing. This wasn't luck or sheer toughness. It was refined engineering shaped over centuries, something even modern materials still haven't fully matched. There's a truth even many scholars once dismissed as saga exaggeration, until textile evidence from Greenland and Iceland finally proved it. Vikings did not sleep alone at sea. Not because they lacked space, but because they mastered a heat retention technique so strange it borders on myth. Hudfat, waterproof 2-person hide sacks lined with fur and sewn shut like a cocoon. Picture a night on the North Atlantic, wind screaming along the hull, the ocean black as whetstone, the air cold enough to crack a wooden barrel left outside. In that kind of cold, cold that can thicken blood in hours, two sailors slid into a single hudfat, sharing breath, sharing heat, sharing survival itself. Forget Hollywood's lone Viking wrapped in a fur pelt. The reality was far more intimate, far more brutal, and far smarter. While one man kept watch, the other kept the sack warm from within. When they switched shifts, the stabilized body heat passed seamlessly to the next. Their bodies formed a closed thermal cycle that never let the cold take the upper hand, a kind of human-powered fire, unknown in any other seafaring culture. And the strangest part, on larger ships, even leaders, men of high status and wealth, weren't allowed to sleep separately. Out there, hierarchy meant nothing. Only heat and death mattered. Once you know this, you realize the Vikings didn't survive the North Atlantic through strength alone, but through a set of survival techniques so unusual they blur the line between intimacy and endurance. And if this detail surprised you, drop a comment. Would you have the courage to share a hudfat with a stranger in the middle of a frozen sea? The moment the massive sail came down didn't just mark the end of a rowing shift or a change of watch. It was the instant a Viking ship transformed from a war machine into a suspended survival tent drifting in the middle of the ocean. As the sail dropped, the heavy animal fat-soaked cloth draped over the hull, the north wind slammed into its edges with a sound like metal scraping stone, and the entire crew had no choice but to curl into one tight mass beneath that fragile cover. Under the thick fabric, smelling of fat and tar, their breath rose in white clouds, mixing with the scent of salt spray and the damp wood shrinking from the cold. The waves pounding the sides of the ship echoed upward like uneven war drums. Everyone squeezed into the narrow gap between the rowing benches, limbs tangled together, wool brushing against fur in a soft, ghostly rustle in the dark. No one spoke, because every breath that held a little warmth was life for the person beside them. What makes this scene even more suffocating is how utterly fragile it was. One sharp gust slipping through the edge of the sail could cut the trapped warmth instantly, and every body would start shaking in the same rhythm. It's almost unbelievable that a single sail, created to catch the wind, when lowered, became the last thin barrier between human beings and the white, silent death waiting outside. What few people imagine about Viking voyages isn't the cold. It's the absolute silence of a hunger that was never eased by a single warm meal. For 3 weeks across the North Atlantic, they lived entirely on cold rations. Dried fish so brittle it snapped like breaking bone. Porridge compressed into dense, brick-hard lumps. And hardtack, those rough survival biscuits that could last for months. So tough, one wrong bite could crack a tooth in half. Yet they kept eating, chewing, swallowing, because every piece of that harsh food was one last fragment of energy their bodies needed to produce heat in conditions that could kill a person within hours. There was no hot soup, no stewed meat, nothing reheated. Everything was cold, stiff, salty, and unforgiving. And it's the absence of a hot meal that becomes the real shock. A civilization famous for its sophisticated longhouse cooking traditions willingly accepted a diet that feels almost inhuman the moment they stepped out to sea. What most people today get wrong is the image of Vikings drifting for months across an icy ocean, battling storms like reckless daredevils. The truth, and this is the core twist, is that they operated a logistical network stretched across the entire North Atlantic coastline. something that looked far more like a chain of military bases than a series of casual stopovers. More than 200 coastal stations have been confirmed through archaeology, from Norway, Shetland, Orkney, and Ireland, all the way to Greenland, each site showing traces of storage houses, hearths, repair yards, food drying areas, and even living spaces for families. This means the Vikings weren't throwing themselves into death the way romantic legends suggest. They were breaking risk into pieces, turning barren rock shores into a chain of supply arteries that powered their entire maritime economy. At Torksey in Scotland, excavations revealed a complex spanning over 55 hectares, a true winter base, complete with hearth systems, smithies, ore repair stations, and net storage buildings, a frontline hub that operated with the precision of a modern military outpost. And this is why they crossed the Atlantic long before any other European civilization, not because of luck or brute strength, but because of a logistical system so sophisticated that some experts today call them the NATO of the Viking Age. You might think the Vikings' greatest secret lived in their swords, their shields, or the longships that pierced the North Atlantic fog like a spear. But when you piece together everything we've uncovered, no fire on board, shared sleep inside Hud-fat cocoons, sails turned into survival tents, weeks of cold rations, and a 200-station coastal logistics web, you begin to see a truth as light as a breath of wind, yet powerful enough to change how we see them entirely. The Vikings didn't survive because they were tough. They survived because they operated with a level of organization and systems thinking far ahead of their age. When they faced an ice-cold wave, they didn't rely on luck. When they bit into a biscuit hard as stone, they didn't ask for pity. When they slept in a cramped hide sack, they didn't treat it as suffering. They turned their own bodies, their clothing, their crewmates, and the natural world into interlocking links, each link essential, each one unable to fail. And here's the part worth remembering. They willingly traded personal comfort for speed, safety, and long-term strategy, a choice richer civilizations never dared to make. The result? They reached North America 5 centuries before Columbus, opened trade routes stretching from Greenland to Constantinople, and became the most feared naval force of medieval Europe, all on ships that carried no fire. If this journey made you see the Vikings in a completely different light, drop a comment below and share your thoughts. And if you want to keep exploring the survival secrets hiding beneath the shine of history, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss the next story.